Section 15 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Dylan King. John Inglesant, A Romance by Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 10. Inglesant was of so much use in gaining information, and managed to live on such confidential terms with many in London in the confidence of members of the Parliament, that he remained there during all the early part of the year, and would have stayed longer. But the enemies of the Archbishop, who pursued him with a malignant and remorseless activity, set their eyes at last upon the young envoy, and he was advised to leave London, at any rate till the trial was over. He was very unwilling to leave the Archbishop, but dared not run the risk of being imprisoned, and thwarting the Jesuits' schemes, and therefore left London about the end of May, and returned straight to Oxford. He left London only a few days before the allied armies of Sir W. Waller and the Earl of Essex, and had no sooner arrived in Oxford than the news of the advance of the parliamentary forces caused the greatest alarm. The next day Abingdon was vacated by some mistake, and the rebels took possession of the whole of the country to the east and south of Oxford, Sir William Waller being on the south, and the Earl of Essex on the east. It was reported in London that the king intended to surrender to the Earl's army, and such a proposition was seriously made to the king by his own friends a few days afterwards in Oxford. The royal army was massed about the city, most of the foot being on the north side. Inglesant served with the foot in Colonel Lake's regiment of musketeers and pikes, taking a pike in the front rank. It was a weapon which the gentlemen of that day frequently practised, and of which he was a master. Several other gentlemen volunteers were in the front rank with him. The Earl's army was drawn up at Islip, on the other side of the river Cherwell, having marched by Oxford the day before, in open file, drums beating and colours flying, so that the king had a full view of them on the bright fine day. The Earl himself, with a party of horse, came within cannon shot of the city, and the king's horse charged him several times without any great hurt on either side. It was a gay and brilliant scene to anyone who could look upon it with careless and indifferent eyes. The next morning a strong party of the Earl's army endeavoured to pass the Cherwell at Gosford Bridge, where Sir Jacob Astley commanded, and where the regiment in which Inglesant served was stationed. The bridge was barricaded with breastworks and a bastion, but the parliamentarian army attempted to cross the stream both above and below. They succeeded in crossing opposite to Colonel Lake's regiment, under a heavy fire from the musketeers, who advanced rank by rank between the troops of pikes, and a little in advance of them, and after giving their fire, wheeled off to the right and left, and took their places again in the rear. The rebels reserved their fire, their men falling at every step, but they still advanced supported by troops of horse, till they reached the royalists, when they delivered their fire, closed their ranks, and charged, their horse charging the pikes at the same time. The ranks of the royal musketeers halted and closed up, and the pikes drew close together, shoulder to shoulder, till the rapiers of their officers met across the front. The shock was very severe, and the struggle for a moment undecided, but the pikes standing perfectly firm, owing in great measure to the number of gentlemen in the front ranks, and the musketeers fighting with great courage, the enemy began to give way, and having been much broken before they came to the charge, fell into disorder, and were driven back across the stream. The royalists following them to the opposite bank, and even pursuing them up the slope. Inglesant had noticed an officer on the opposite side who was fighting with great courage, and as they crossed the river he saw him stumble and nearly fall, though he appeared to struggle forward on the opposite slope, to where an old thorn tree broke the rank of the pikes. Johnny came close to him and recognized him as the Mr. Thorn whom he had known at Gidding. As he knew the regiment would be halted immediately, he fell out of his rank, leaving his file to the bringer-up, or lieutenant behind him, and stooped over his old rival, who evidently was desperately hurt. He raised his head, and gave him some aqua vita from his flask. The other knew him at once, and tried to speak, but his strength was too far gone, and his utterance failed him. He seemed to give over the effort, and lay back in Inglesant's arms, staining his friend with his blood. Inglesant asked him if he had any mission he would wish performed, but the other shook his head, and seemed to give himself to prayer. After a minute or two he seemed to rally, and his face became very calm. Opening his eyes, he looked at Johnny steadily and with affection, and said slowly and with difficulty, but still with a look of rest and peace, "Mr. Inglesant, you spoke of me once, of standing together in a brighter dawn. I did not believe you, but it was true. The dawn is breaking, and it is bright." As he spoke, a volley of musketry shook the hillside, and the regiment came down the slope at a run, and carrying Inglesant with them, crossed the river, and, halting on the other side, wheeled about and faced the passage in the same order which they had stood at first. This dangerous maneuver was executed only just in time, for the enemy advanced in great force to the riverside, but the royalists being also very strong, they did not attempt to pass. After facing each other for some time, the fighting having ceased all along the line, Inglesant spoke to his officer, and got leave to cross the river with a flag of truce to seek his friend. An officer from the other side met him, most of the enemy's troops having fallen back some distance from the river. He was an old soldier, evidently a Low Country officer, and not much of a Puritan, and he greeted Inglesant politely as a fellow soldier. Inglesant told him his errand, and that he was anxious to find out his friend's body, if, as he feared, he would be found to have breathed his last. They went to the Old Thorn, where indeed they found Mr. Thorn quite dead. Several of the rebel officers gathered round. Mr. Thorn was evidently well known, and they spoke of him with respect and regard. Inglesant stopped, looking down on him for a few minutes, and then turned to go. "Gentlemen," he said, raising his hat, "I leave him in your care. He was, as you have well said, a brave and good man. I crossed his path twice, once in love and once in war, and at both times he acted as a gallant gentleman and a man of God. I wish you good day." He turned away, and went down to the river, from which his regiment had by this time also fallen back, the others looking after him as he went. "Who is that?" said a stern and grim-looking Puritan officer. "He does not speak as the graceless cavaliers mostly do." "His name is Inglesant," said a quiet, pale man in dark and plain clothes. "He is one of the king's servants, a concealed papist, and they say a Jesuit. I have seen him often at Whitehall." "Thou wilt not see him much longer, brother," said the other grimly, "either at Whitehall or elsewhere. It were a good deed to prevent his further deceiving the poor and ignorant folk." And he raised his piece to fire. "Scarcely," said the other quietly, "since he came to do us service and courtesy." But he made no effort to restrain the Puritan, looking on, indeed, with a sort of quiet interest as to what would happen. "Thou art enslaved overmuch to the customs of this world, brother," said the other, still with his grave smile. "Knowest thou not that it is the part of the saints militant to root out iniquity from the earth?" He arranged his piece to fire, and would no doubt have done so, but the Low Country officer, who had been looking on in silence, suddenly threw himself upon the weapon and wrested it out of his hand. "By my soul, master, fight the fight," he said. "That passes a joke. The good cause is well enough, and the saints militant and triumphant, and all the rest of it. But to shoot a man under a flag of truce was never yet required of any saint, whether militant or triumphant." The other looked at him severely as he took back his weapon. "Thou art in the bonds of iniquity thyself," he said, "and in the land of darkness and the shadow of death, the Lord's cause will never prosper while it puts trust in such as thou." But he made no further attempt against Inglesant, who indeed by this time had crossed the river and was out of musket shot on the opposite bank. A few days afterwards the king left Oxford and went into the west. Inglesant remained in garrison, and took his share in all the expeditions of any kind that were undertaken. The Roman Catholics were at this time very strong in Oxford. They celebrated Mass every day, and had frequent sermons at which many of the Protestants attended. But it was thought among the church people to be an extreme thing to do, and any of the commanders who did it excited suspicion thereby. The Church of England people were by this time growing jealous of the power and unrestrained license of the Catholics, and the Jesuit warned Inglesant to attach himself more to the English Church party, and avoid being much seen with extreme papists. Colonel Gage, a papist, was appointed governor by the king, but being a very prudent man and a general favourite, as well as an excellent officer, the appointment did not give much offence. Inglesant was present at Capri Bridge, which battle or skirmish was fought after the king returned to Oxford from his hasty march through Worcestershire, and was wounded severely in the head by a sword cut, a wound which he thought little of at the time, but which long afterwards made itself felt. Notwithstanding this wound, he intended following the king into the west, for his majesty had latterly shown a greater kindness to him, and a wish to keep him near his person. But Father St. Clare, after an interview with the king, told Inglesant that he had a mission for him to perform in London, and so kept him in Oxford. The trial of the archbishop was dragging slowly on through the year, and the Jesuit procured Inglesant another pass and directed him to endeavour in every way to assist the archbishop in his trial, without fear of his prosecutors, telling him that he could procure his liberation even if he were put in prison, which he did not believe he would be. Inglesant, therefore, on his return to London, gave himself heartily to assisting the council and secretary of the archbishop, and found himself perfectly unmolested in so doing. He lodged at a druggist's over against the Goat Tavern, near Toy Bridge in the Strand, and frequented the ordinary at Haycock's, near the Palsgrave Head Tavern, where the Parliament men much resorted. Here he met among others Sir Henry Blunt, who had been a gentleman pensioner of the king's, and had waited on him in his turn to York and Edgehill fight. But then, returning to London, walked into Westminster Hall, with his sword by his side, so coolly as to astonish the parliamentarians. He was summoned before the Parliament, but pleading that he only did his duty as a servant, was acquitted. This man, who was a man of judgment and experience, was of great use to Inglesant in many ways, and put him in the way of finding much that might assist the archbishop, but it occurred to Inglesant more than once to doubt whether the latter would benefit much by his advocacy, a known pupil of the papists as he was. This caused him to keep more quiet than he otherwise would have done, but was doubtless of the Jesuits' chief aim was completely answered. For the church people, both in London and the country, who regarded the archbishop as a martyr, becoming aware of the sincere and really useful exertions that Inglesant had made with such untiring energy, attached themselves entirely to him, and took him completely into their confidence, so that he could at this time had depended on any of them for assistance and support. The different parties were at this time so confused and intermixed, the papists playing in many cases a double game, that it would have been difficult for Inglesant, who was partly in the confidence of all, to know which way to act, had he stood alone. He saw now, more than he had ever done, the intrigues of that party among the papists who favoured the Parliament, and was astonished at their skill and duplicity. At last the Commons, failing to find the archbishop guilty of anything worthy of death, passed a bill of attainder, as they had done with Lord Strafford, and condemned him with no precedence of law. The Lords hesitated to pass this bill, and on Christmas Eve 1644 demanded a conference with the Commons. The next day was the strangest Christmas day Inglesant had ever spent. The whole city was ordered to fast in the most solemn way by a special ordinance of the Parliament, and strict inquisition was made to see that this ordinance was carried out by the people. Inglesant was well acquainted with Mr. Hale, afterwards Chief Justice Hale, one of the Archbishop's council, then a young lawyer in Lincoln's Inn, who, it was said, had composed the defence which Mr. Hearn, the senior counsel, had spoken before the Lords. Johnny spent most of the morning with this gentleman, and in the afternoon walked down to the Tower from Lincoln's Inn. The streets were very quiet, the shops closed, and a feeling of sadness and dread hung over all, at any rate in Inglesant's mind. At the turnstile at Holborn, he went into a bookseller's shop kept by a man named Turner, a papist, who sold popish books and pamphlets. Here he found an apothecary, who was also useful to the Catholics, making hosts for them. These both immediately began to speak to Inglesant about the archbishop and the papists, expressing their surprise that he should exert himself so much in his favour, telling him that the papists, to a man, hated him and desired his death, and that a gentleman lately returned from Italy had that very day informed the bookseller that the news of the archbishop's execution was eagerly expected in Rome. The lords were certain to give way, they said, and the archbishop was as good as dead already. They were evidently very anxious to extract from Inglesant whether he acted on his own responsibility or from the directions of the Jesuit, but Inglesant was much too prudent to commit himself in any way. When he had left them, he went straight to the Tower, where he was admitted to the archbishop, whom he found expecting him. He gave him all the intelligence he could, and all the gossip of the day which he had picked up, including the sayings of the wits at the taverns and ordinaries respecting the trial and the archbishop, of whom all men's minds were full. Laud was inclined to trust somewhat to the lord's resistance, and Inglesant had scarcely the heart to refute his opinion. He told him the feeling of the papists, and his fear that even the Catholics at Oxford were not acting sincerely with him. After the failure of the king's pardon, Laud entertained little hope from any other efforts Charles might be disposed to make, but Inglesant promised him to ride to Oxford and to see the Jesuit again. This he did the next day, before the committee of the Commons met the Lords, which they did not do till the 2nd of January. He had a long interview with the Jesuit, and urged as strongly as he could the cruelty and impolicy of letting the archbishop die without an effort to save him. "What can be done?" said the Jesuit. "The king can do nothing. All that he can do in the way of pardon he has done. Besides, I never see the king. The feeling against the Catholics is now so strong that his majesty dare not hold any communications with me." Inglesant inquired what the policy of the Roman Catholic Church really was. Was it favourable to the king and the English Church, or against it? The Jesuit hesitated, but then, with that appearance of frankness which always won upon his pupil, he confessed that the policy of the papal court had latterly gone very much more in favour of the party who wished to destroy the English Church than it had formerly done, and that at present the Pope and the Catholic powers abroad were only disposed to help the king on such terms as he could not accept, and at the same time retain the favour of the Church and Protestant party, and he acknowledged that he himself underestimated the opposition of the bulk of English people to popery. He then requested Inglesant to return to London, and continue to show himself openly in support of the archbishop, assuring him that in this way alone he could be fit himself for performing a most important service to the king, which, he said, he should soon be able to point out to him. The old familiar charm, which had lost none of its power over Johnny, would, of itself, have been sufficient to make him perfectly pliant to the Jesuit's will. He returned to London, but was refused admission to the archbishop until after the committee of the Commons had met the Lords, and on the 3rd of January the Lords passed the Bill of Attainder. When the news of this reached the archbishop, he broke off his history which he had written from day to day, and prepared himself for death. He petitioned that he might be beheaded instead of hanged, and the Commons at last, after much difficulty, granted this request. On the 6th of January it was ordered by both houses that he should suffer on the 10th. On the same day Inglesant received a special message from the Jesuit in these words in cipher: "Apply for admission to the scaffold. It will be granted to you." Very much surprised, Inglesant went to Alderman Pennington and requested admission to attend the archbishop to the scaffold, pleading that he was one of the king's household and attached to the archbishop from a boy. Pennington examined him concerning his being in London, his pass, and place of abode, but Inglesant thought more from curiosity than from any other motive. for it was evident that he knew all about him and his behaviour in London. He asked him many questions about Oxford and the Catholics, and seemed to enjoy any embarrassment that Inglesant was put into replying. Finally, he gave himself the warrant of admission and dismissed him. But as he left the room, he called him back and said with great emphasis, "I would warn you, young man, to look very well to your steps. You are treading a path full of pitfalls, few of which you see yourself. All your steps are known, and those are known who are leading you. They think they hold the wires in their own hands, and do not know that they are but the puppets themselves. If you are not altogether in the snare of the destroyer, come out from them, and escape both destruction in this world and the wrath that is to come." Inglesant thanked him and took his leave. He could not help thinking that there was much truth in the alderman's description of his position. The next 3 days the archbishop spent in preparing for death and composing his speech, and on the day on which he was to die, Inglesant found when he reached the Tower that he was at his private prayers, at which he continued until Pennington arrived to conduct him to the scaffold. When he came out and found Inglesant there, he seemed pleased, as well he might, for expecting Sterne, his chaplain, the only one who was allowed to attend him, he was alone amongst his enemies. He ascended the scaffold with a brave and cheerful courage, some few of the vast crowd assembled reviling him, but the greater part preserving a decent and respectful silence. The chaplain and Inglesant followed him close, and it was well they did so, for a crowd of people, whether by permission or not is not known, pressed up upon the scaffold, as Dr. Heylin said, "upon the theatre to see the tragedy," so that they pressed upon the archbishop, and scarcely gave him room to die. Inglesant had never seen such a wonderful sight before. Once afterwards he saw one like it, more terrible by far. The little island of the scaffold, surrounded by a surging, pressing sea of heads and struggling men, covering the whole extent of Tower Hill, the houses and windows round full of people, the walls and towers behind covered too, people pressed underneath the scaffold, people climbed up the posts and hung suspended by the rails that fenced it round, people pressed up the steps till there was scarcely room within the rails to stand. The soldiers on guard seemed careless what was done, probably feeling certain that there was no fear of any attempt to rescue the hated priest. Inglesant recognized many churchmen and friends of the archbishop among the crowd, and saw that they recognized him, and that his name was passed about among both friends and enemies. The archbishop read his speech with great calmness and distinctness, the opening moving many to tears, and when he had finished, gave the papers to Sterne to give to his other chaplains, praying God to bestow his mercies and blessings upon them. He spoke to a man named Hind, who sat taking down his speech, begging him not to do him wrong by mistaking him. Then, begging the crowd to stand back and give him room, he knelt down to the block. But seeing through the chinks of the boards the people underneath, he begged that they might be removed, as he did not wish that his blood should fall upon the heads of the people. Surely no man was ever so crowded upon and badgered to his death. Then he took off his doublet, and would have addressed himself to prayer, but was not allowed to do so in peace. One Sir John Clotworthy, an Irishman, pestering him with religious questions. After he had answered one or two meekly, he turned to the executioner and forgave him, and kneeling down, after a very short prayer, to which Hind listened with his head down and wrote word for word, the axe with a single blow cut off his head. He was buried in All Hallows Barking, a great crowd of people attending him to the grave in silence and great respect. The Church of England's service read over him without interruption, though it had long been discontinued in all the churches in London. News of his death spread rapidly over England, and was received by all church people with religious fervour as the news of a martyrdom. And whether it was told, it was added that Mr. John Inglesant, the king's servant, who had used every effort to aid the archbishop on his trial, was with him on the scaffold to the last. Inglesant returned to Oxford, where the Jesuit received him cordially. He had, it would have seemed, failed in his mission, for the archbishop was dead. Nevertheless, the Jesuits' aim was finally won. On the king's leaving Oxford before the advance of General Fairfax, Inglesant accompanied him, and was present at the Battle of Naseby, so fatal to the royal cause. No mention of this battle, however, is to be found among the papers from which these memoirs are compiled, and the fact that Inglesant was present at it is known only by an incidental reference to it at a later period. Amid the confusion of the flight, and the subsequent wanderings of the king before he returned to Oxford, it is impossible to follow less important events closely, and it does not seem clear whether Inglesant met with the Jesuit immediately after the battle or not. Acting, however, there can be no doubt, with his approval, if not by his direction, he appears very soon after to have found his way to Gidding, where he remained during several weeks. End of section 15.